In this lecture, we'll look at the pancreas and spleen. So we'll start off by looking at the position of the pancreas and spleen and how they project onto the surface. We'll then look at the gross anatomy, look at the anterior and posterior views of the pancreas. We'll look at its structure. We'll look at the relationship the pancreas has specifically to the superior mesenteric vessels. And then we'll look at the blood supply and its venous drainage. And then towards the end, we'll look at the anatomy of the spleen. But let's concentrate on the pancreas, which is this leaf-shaped accessory digestive gland that is positioned transversely across the posterior abdominal wall. Its head, as we saw previously, sits in the concavity of the C-shaped duodenum. It is involved essentially in producing pancreatic juice, which is its exocrine function, and producing glucagon and insulin, which is its endocrine function. So if we look at the surface anatomy, then here on the torso we can see we have the C-shaped duodenum and we have the head of the pancreas sitting in that concavity. We can then have the neck and the body and the tail of the pancreas passing transversely across the abdomen. What we would have and what we can't see here is in the tail of the pancreas, we could have the spleen, which would be positioned over in this left upper quadrant. It's difficult to see the pancreas when we put all the other organs in position because it lies posteriorly. The pancreas is a retroperitoneal organ, and we can actually see that the pancreas would just be around about in this position, deep to the stomach and surrounded intimately via the duodenum. So let's have some key facts about the pancreas. It's an elongated accessory organ of digestion. It's leaf shape. As I've mentioned, its head sits within the concavity of the duodenum and the tail runs up against the hilum of the spleen. It's positioned on the posterior wall of the lesser sac or the mental bursa, and it's made up of 5 parts. We have a head, sits against the duodenum, we have a neck, a body, and a tail that extend towards the hilum of the spleen. Running inframedially from the head, we have this hook-like process known as the uncinate process. The root of the transverse mesocolon runs along the pancreas's anterior surface. And as I've mentioned, the primary functions of the pancreas are exocrine and endocrine. Exocrine, which is going to be secreted away from the body, so ultimately excreted out with the stools, is it produces pancreatic juice to aid digestion. And the endocrine function, which is the release of these hormones into the bloodstream like glycogen and insulin. So if we were to just look at the position of the pancreas, then that's best done with all of the vast majority of the organs removed. So what we can see is that the large intestines, which would be here and here, have been removed. The small intestine, except the duodenum, which is positioned here, has been removed. And that really gives us a clear window onto the floor of the abdominal cavity, onto the kind of posterior wall of the abdominal cavity, where we can just make out the pancreas. The stomach's been removed as well. We can see the pancreas would be in this position, straddling, lying over the L1-2 lumbar vertebra. We can see where the stomach would be. That's got an opening here for the esophagus that's passing through the diaphragm, and these would be connected up in this kind of arrangement where we'd have the stomach shielding the pancreas. So the pancreas is a retroperitoneal organ, except for the tail that passes to the hilum of the spleen within what's known as the spleno-renal ligament. The tail of the pancreas passes to the spleen with the spleno-renal ligament that contains the splenic artery and splenic vein. The root of the transverse mesocolon originates, and we can see the cut edge of the transverse mesocolon here. So that is the root of the transverse mesocolon, and it forms the posterior boundary of the omental bursa. Posterior boundary of the omental bursa. Here we've added a few more organs, a few more detail. We can see we have the left kidney, which is here, and here we can see the right kidney. We've also got the duodenum, and we've added in some important blood vessels. Coming from the aorta, we've added in the superior mesenteric artery, and here's the inferior vena cava. But importantly, here is the hepatic portal vein, and here we can see the superior mesenteric vein. And we'll look at the formation of the portal vein later on. But down here we can see the posterior view. So this again is if you're looking at the duodenum and the pancreas through my posterior abdominal wall, then you can see that we have the C-shaped duodenum, head of the pancreas, and running posterior to the neck of the pancreas being this kind of region, running posterior to the neck of the pancreas, we have these two blood vessels, superior mesenteric artery and superior mesenteric vein. We can actually see their intimate relationship really clearly. If we look here, we can see we have what's known as the uncinate process of the pancreas, and that is lying kind of inframedially running away from the head. We can see we have the horizontal and the ascending part of the duodenum. Now, importantly, these two blood vessels, the superior mesenteric blood vessels, are lying anterior to the uncinate process and to the horizontal part of the duodenum. These two superior mesenteric blood vessels are lying anterior to the uncinate process and the horizontal part of the duodenum. But they then run posterior, both of them run posterior to the neck of the pancreas. So if you imagine this is our pancreas here, and we've got the uncinate process, and we have the head of the pancreas here, we've got the neck and the body and the tail, and we've got two superior mesenteric vessels. It's running up in this direction, anterior to the uncinate process and then posterior to the neck. And that's hopefully what we can see in this diagram. The posterior view shows that well. Where we can't see the superior mesenteric vessels here, the posterior view, we can see them here. Also, we can see the superior mesenteric vein is actually receiving the splenic vein here. So at the neck of the pancreas, deep to the neck of the pancreas, we have the formation of the hepatic portal vein. Here we have the superior mesenteric vein, here we have the splenic vein, and where these two unite, we then have the hepatic portal vein that's running up towards the liver. If we look at the tail of the pancreas over here, then we could draw in what would be the spleen. That would be in this position around here, not included in this cartoon. And actually running towards the hilum of the spleen, we'd find the splenorenal ligament. So the pancreas, within its relations to the other organs, and especially those blood vessels. So if we look at the pancreas and now look at it through the prism of the biliary tree and the gallbladder that we've mentioned before, then what you can remember is that we've got our gallbladder here. We can see our gallbladder, we've got our fundus, we've got our body, we've got our neck, and we've got our cystic duct here. Here we've also got our two hepatic ducts that form the common hepatic duct. The union of the common hepatic duct and the cystic duct forms the bile duct. The bile duct is then going to run within the portal triad. It runs within the portal triad, is going to run posterior to the duodenum. It then runs along the posterior surface of the head of the pancreas. So the bile duct then unites with the main pancreatic duct, running from the tail of the pancreas and then dipping down through the uncinate process. We have the main pancreatic duct. The main pancreatic duct, which we can see here as well, is also then going to combine with the bile duct, which we can just pick out here. These dotted lines indicate that it's running posterior, okay? But the bile duct would be coming in this direction. The bile duct runs posterior to the duodenum, posterior to the head of the pancreas, and it unites with the bile duct. And where the main pancreatic duct and the bile duct unite, we find we have the hepatopancreatic ampulla. The hepatopancreatic ampulla is this dilation. And the dilation is surrounded by a sphincter, a smooth muscle sphincter known as the hepatopancreatic sphincter. And this is controlled by the autonomic nervous system. It's controlled by the autonomic nervous system. And that can regulate the activity of the sphincter, so that when the sphincter relaxes, pancreatic juice and bile can pass through the major duodenal papilla, which we can see here, and support digestion. Bile can emulsify the fats, and the pancreatic juice can help to break down the ingested food. We also have a minor duodenal papilla, which is slightly superior, and that is the opening for the accessory pancreatic duct, and that doesn't receive any inputs from the bile duct. So the biliary tree is vitally important for bile and pancreatic juice entering into the digestive system at the level of the descending part of the duodenum. So the spleen. The spleen is really important because it's associated with being a reservoir of blood. It's responsible for releasing blood with hemorrhagic shock, and it's also important lymphoid tissue. We can see the spleen up here. It's quite difficult to see in the anterior aspect, but the spleen would just be in this region here. It's positioned against ribs 9, 10, and 11. So we can see rib 12, 11, rib 12, 11, 10, 9. So they're the ribs that the spleen sits against, which means that if these ribs were to be fractured, then they could actually penetrate the spleen. It's the largest lymphatic organ, so that's its main function, and it's intraperitoneal. It's suspended via two peritoneal ligaments, the splenorenal and the gastrosplenic. It forms the left boundary, as we're aware, of the omental bursa. Its relationship is next to the stomach, it's next to the left kidney, and it's next to the splenic flexure of the colon, where the transverse becomes the descending. It also filters blood, acts as a reservoir, as I mentioned, and essentially it acts as a large lymph node. So in situ, the spleen, which we can see here, is nicely tucked up against the greater curvature of the stomach. That's why it's associated with the stomach. And we can see here the tail of the pancreas is running towards the hilum of the spleen. If we look at the spleen in isolation, then we've got this inferior border here, and we have the superior border. We can see that it has various impressions. So this impression inferiorly here is where the kidney will be located. And then we have an impression where the stomach will be located. And then we'd also have an impression where the splenic flexure of the colon would be located. Its diaphragmatic is relatively smooth, sitting against the left aspect of the diaphragm, just inferior to the left dome of the diaphragm. So if we look at the blood supply to the pancreas and the spleen, again we need to look at the celiac trunk. We can see the celiac trunk is giving rise to a whole series of blood vessels. It gives rise to a big branch that runs along the posterior aspect of the pancreas towards the spleen, and that's the splenic artery. Coming off the splenic artery, we have some small branches that supply the body and tail and neck of the pancreas. But importantly, at the head region, we have what are known as pancreatico-duodenal arteries. So here we can see pancreatico-duodenal arteries. They supply the pancreas and the duodenum. We have a superior pancreatico-duodenal artery, and that comes from the celiac trunk by way of various branches like the gastroduodenal. And that has superior pancreatico-duodenal artery, has anterior and posterior branches, which we can see running on the anterior and the posterior surface of the pancreas and the duodenum. Coming from the superior mesenteric artery, we also have inferior pancreatico-duodenal arteries, and these themselves have anterior and posterior branches, which supply the anterior and posterior surface of the duodenum and the pancreas. We'll explore these in more detail when we look at the arterial supply to the gastrointestinal tract in a later lecture. So in conclusion, we've looked at the position of the pancreas and spleen within the abdominal cavity, and then we've looked at its gross anatomy. We looked at peritoneal relations of the pancreas and the spleen, whether they're retroperitoneal or intraperitoneal. And then we looked at the structure of the pancreas to include its head, neck, body, tail, uncinate process, and its relationship with those superior mesenteric vessels. We then looked at the pancreatic ducts and the biliary tree, and finished by looking at the structure and the location of the spleen.